So by now, it might be becoming a little bit more obvious as to what kinds of history that I'm interested in. Um, I've reviewed a couple of history books, I think, already that sort of take me up right to the cusp of where most of my reading in history ends, which is at World War One or thereabouts. I'm not saying I don't read any history after that, but certainly not as much as I do before. And this is another one of those books that rests right on that cusp. It's Modris Eksteins, The Rites of Spring, The Great War and the Birth of the Modern Age. This is a wonderful book. It talks about, really, both the title and the subtitle sum it up nicely. It's about how World War One and the things that happened somewhat before and somewhat after World War One basically shaped culture, music, art, literature, politics, and the things that were going on in the world generally around the time. A lot of ink has been spilled, of course, in trying to locate the origin of modernism. Modernism in the sense of not philosophical modernism like since Descartes or anything, but artistic and literary modernism, which is probably datable to maybe the second half of the 19th century. And Modris Eksteins is not the first historian to suggest that it occurred sometime, or at least had a spark on the evening of May 29th, 1913, at the Paris premiere of Stravinsky's the Rite of Spring. The French is La Sacrée du Printemps. Ekstein's social theory, however, is as thoroughly compelling as any, and it reintroduces you to a lot of the characters in both the balletic production of the Rites of Spring and also to the broader cultural sort of mise-en-scene of what was going on, the eccentric personalities of Diaghilev and Nijinsky, and the founding of the Ballet Russe. Talks about the totally arrhythmic music of Stravinsky and the spasmodic modes of dance and the wildness of that May night that was far too much for the audience. He says, the ballet contains and illustrates many of the essential features of modern revolt. The overt hostility to inherited form, the fascination with primitivism, and indeed with anything that contradicts the notions of civilization. The emphasis on vitalism as opposed to rationalism, the perception of existence as a continuous flux and series of relations, not as constants and absolutes, and the psychological introspection accompanying the rebellion against social convention. And if you could sum up what modernism is in just a few words, those might be some of those words, because that really sums up not just the ballet itself, but also the spirit of the times, the zeitgeist. Had this primitivism been wholly confined to the stage, it may not have caused the outright riot that it did that night. But in many ways, the performance was symbolic of a number of other paradigm shifts in culture and politics, which can be seen as leading up to the Great War. His book begins with no overt political concerns, but it does move on to all the territory that you would expect of a book that has the subtitle, The Great War and the Birth of the Modern Age. The unification, the industrialization, the modernization of Germany is nicely synthesized, and the more explicit cultural effects are talked about. The rise of a certain vitalistic German idealism, especially seen in the eminent cultural German critics of the time, an increasingly prevalent culture conf, and the eschewal of what was perceived as a weak, bourgeois, wimpy liberalism of the French and the English. Germans wanted to fight against this. And not only did Germans seek out a kind of Nietzschean transvaluation of values, but they saw this as inseparable from their innovative modes of warfare, especially toxic gas and submarine technology, which they saw as attempts to assert the superiority of the German Geist. And for a fuller treatment of these themes, I've already posted a review on YouTube of Fritz Stern's excellent book, The Politics of Cultural Despair, Study in the Rise of Germanic Ideology. So if you're really interested in those themes, certainly read that as well. The sections in the book, Madness and Reason, Reason and Madness, and The Sacred Dance, discuss the extreme effects that trench warfare wrought on soldiers. Of course, World War I being the war where trench warfare is usually recognized as coming about. And it really paints a stark picture of the origin of the term shell shock, and it actually comes out of World War I. Feelings, sympathy, and memories couldn't survive on the battlefield, and failure to expurgate them would lead to insanity. And just as he tried to delouse himself as regularly as possible, writes one writer, Jacques Rivière, so the combatant took care to kill in himself, one by one, as soon as they appeared, before he was bitten, every one of his feelings. Now he clearly saw that the feelings were vermin, and that there was nothing to do but treat them as such. So, not only is this obviously a physically horrifying environment to be in, but it casts reverberations down through the years. Only now, with wars in lived memory, do we think about the effects of PTSD and other kinds of effects that warfare has. But this has happened in every war, and you really don't hear about it in earlier wars, but he talks about it here. Eksteins also talks about disillusionment, which he claims believably never took hold in Germany during the war as it did in France and England. And when it did exist, it was much more common among the civilians than the fighting soldiers, though, as Eksteins says, the language and literature of disillusionment would, on the whole, be a post-war phenomenon everywhere, not just in England and France. Literature describing the permanent psychological effects on soldiers is much older than the Great War, but as I said, is rarely given the really important consideration that Eksteins gives it here. One of the most compelling vignettes is the extended retelling of Lindbergh's transatlantic flight during May of 1927. Contemporaries saw his feat as a point of historical torsion, enabling both a revival of the imagination, a birth of individualism, and sort of a birth of Dionysian will. But it was also a sign for all that was gone and for all that would never be regained. Eksteins says that freedom was no longer a matter of being at liberty to do what was morally right and ethically responsible. Freedom had become a personal matter, a responsibility above all to oneself. The modern impulse before the war had possessed a strong measure of optimism springing from a bourgeois religion of meliorism. That optimism had not disappeared entirely by the 1920s, but it was now more wish than confident prediction. Its landscape was one of destruction and desolation, not simply the barrenness that the avant-garde had so despised before the war. So really a nice narrative about how World War One fits into the what we usually think about modernism. There's not a lot of, this is not revisionist history or nothing much controversial here, and you do very often find it on syllabi for undergraduate and even sometimes the occasional graduate course on, say, the birth of modernism, or a history course on World War One. So if you're interested in these topics, you can certainly do a lot worse than this. The Rites of Spring, The Great War and the Birth of the Modern Age by Modris Eksteins.